My name is Isabel Hart, and this is how one dinner changed everything. It was Thanksgiving night in Indianapolis. The table gleamed, the turkey was perfect, and my father sat at the head, his glass raised high. Then he said it. "Some kids make you proud," he declared, pausing just long enough for the sting to land, "and others just take up space." The room erupted in laughter. My brother, his wife, even the kids who didn't understand the cruelty yet. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I just smiled and said, "Good thing I just bought my own place 3,000 miles away. Don't worry, you'll never have to make space for me again." The silence that followed was louder than any argument I could have made, and for the first time that evening, he had nothing left to say. Have you ever been humiliated by your own family and smiled just to survive it? Tell me where you're watching from. I want to know I'm not alone. I grew up in a quiet suburb on the edge of Indianapolis, where every lawn looked the same, every mailbox carried the same family name, and every father seemed proud of his son. Our house was small, white with green shutters, the kind of place that smelled like coffee and motor oil. Neighbors waved when they mowed their lawns, and on Sundays everyone went to the same diner after church. To them, my family was perfect. Robert, the dependable father; Linda, the gentle homemaker; Ethan, the local football hero; and me, the quiet one they barely remembered to mention. From the outside, we looked picture perfect. Inside, I was the shadow that made the light seem brighter on someone else. Ethan was always the center of attention. His trophies lined the hallway like a museum of my father's pride: silver footballs, medals, certificates that gleamed under the hallway light. I used to run my fingers across the polished plaques, tracing the engraved letters of his name while wondering if my own name would ever belong there. When Ethan won, Dad would lift him on his shoulders. When I won, he'd glance at my ribbon and say, "That's cute, honey. But don't forget Ethan's game is tonight." I remember that sentence more vividly than any lullaby. It was the rhythm of my childhood, the beat of favoritism that never stopped. At 10, I had my first science fair when a small blue ribbon pinned to a cardboard volcano that actually erupted with baking soda and vinegar. I'd worked for weeks, sneaking into the kitchen after everyone slept, testing proportions under the hum of the refrigerator light. I thought maybe this time Dad would look at me differently. When I showed him the ribbon, he just chuckled. "That's nice, Izzy. But make sure you're ready for your brother's big match tonight. He'll need all of us cheering." That word "us" never really included me. My birthday came 2 months later. Mom baked me a small vanilla cake, plain, no frosting, flowers, no candles that spelled out my name. "It's just family this year," she said softly. But the next week, they threw Ethan a backyard party for his college acceptance. Tents, music, half the neighborhood. I remember standing by the window, watching the fairy lights flicker in the yard while my brother posed with his friends, holding his cake that read "To Our Star." That was the night I realized invisibility wasn't an accident in our family, it was a tradition. Even dinner carried its hierarchy. Our oak dining table had 6 chairs, 4 for adults and 2 smaller ones at the end. For years, even as I grew taller, they never moved me from the kids' table. When I was 16, I sat there again, knees bumping the edge, listening to grown-up conversations I was never invited into. Every attempt I made to speak was met with polite nods, quick dismissals, or worse, silence. Ethan could talk about anything. College football, cars, weather, and Dad would beam like he'd spoken poetry. If I brought up something I'd learned, like the fact that honey never spoils, or that light from distant stars was older than our planet, Dad would frown. "You think too much, Izzy. You'll tire yourself out." Mom wasn't cruel. She was careful. The kind of woman who believed keeping peace meant keeping quiet. When Dad spoke, she'd fold napkins. When I cried, she'd whisper, "Don't make things harder for your father." Her softness hurt more than his words. At least his sharpness acknowledged my existence. Hers erased it. There's a picture somewhere, Thanksgiving, maybe 2006. Ethan's standing behind Dad, both in matching shirts, grinning. I'm off to the side, a blur half out of frame, holding a plate. Mom took that photo. I looked at it once years later, noticing how my smile didn't quite reach my eyes. You can see it, if you know what to look for: the quiet child trying not to take up too much space in her own home. Still, I tried to earn my way in. Straight A's, scholarships, volunteering, building robots from old radios, none of it cracked the wall. The more I achieved, the more invisible I became, as if my brightness threatened to disturb their picture. Once, when I was 15, Ethan failed an exam, and Dad spent the entire weekend helping him study. The same weekend, I received a letter for a state science competition. When I handed it to him, he nodded distractedly, eyes still on Ethan's notes. "That's good," he said. "Just don't make your brother feel bad." That sentence stayed with me. Don't make your brother feel bad. It taught me the first rule of our household: my silence was the price of their comfort. Looking back now, I realize how early I learned to disappear. I learned to laugh softly, to shrink in photos, to walk lightly so the floorboards wouldn't creak. I learned to make myself small enough to fit into the leftover spaces no one wanted. By the time I was 18, I had already perfected the art of being unseen. The basement became my refuge long before I knew the meaning of the word. While upstairs echoed with the sound of ESPN highlights and my father's booming laughter, the world below was filled with quiet: the hum of an old fluorescent light, the faint buzz of electricity running through tangled cords, the smell of dust and metal. It was cold in the winter and damp in the spring, but it was mine. Every corner of that unfinished space, from the crooked shelves stacked with broken appliances to the workbench littered with screwdrivers, became a kind of sanctuary. I didn't have a room where my voice mattered, but I had a place where things listened when I touched them. It started with a broken radio I found in a box my father was about to throw out. He had muttered something about useless junk, but to me it looked like a mystery waiting to be solved. I took it downstairs, unscrewed the back panel, and stared at the strange, intricate world of wires and circuits inside. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I knew it had once carried music, that somewhere inside the silence was a song trapped, waiting for someone to bring it back. I spent hours cross-legged on the concrete floor, reading library books about transistor boards and frequency coils, following YouTube tutorials late at night when everyone was asleep. After a week of trial and error, a faint crackle came through the speaker, then a burst of static, and finally, a voice. I remember the way my chest filled with something I couldn't name: pride, maybe, or relief. I had made something broken work again. For the first time, something in my world listened when I spoke. I ran upstairs, still holding the dusty radio, and called out, "Dad, look. I fixed it." He barely looked up from the TV. "That old thing? Huh. Well, get your brother a drink, will you? He's been practicing all day." I stood there for a few seconds, still holding the radio like proof that I existed. Then I turned around, walked back downstairs, and set it on my workbench. I never mentioned it again. That was the night I made myself a promise. If no one in this house would notice me, I would build something that couldn't be ignored. From then on, the basement became more than a hiding place. It was a workshop of small rebellions. I took apart anything I could get my hands on. Clocks, microwaves, broken game consoles. I learned how to solder, how to strip wires, how to bring dead things back to life. Each spark that flared from my soldering iron felt like a heartbeat, a pulse that reminded me I was still here, still capable. There was something almost sacred in the way broken objects surrendered to patience. Machines didn't care about charm or popularity. They responded to effort, to persistence, to understanding. I couldn't fix my family, but I could fix everything else. One summer, when I was 16, I built my first computer entirely out of discarded parts from the local recycling center. The fan rattled, the screen flickered, but when it powered on, I felt like I had opened a portal into another world. I taught myself basic coding, learned to print 3D prototypes from online blueprints, and filled notebooks with sketches of designs I would one day create for real. It was never about escaping reality. It was about building one where I could finally belong. Of course, my father didn't see it that way. He'd come downstairs occasionally, usually when he needed to store old paint cans or broken furniture. He'd glance around, frown at the clutter of circuit boards and wires, and mutter, "You should spend less time with junk and more time doing something useful." I never bothered explaining that junk was what kept me alive. My mother would sometimes peek in, her face half-lit by the narrow stairway light. "Don't work too hard, Isabel," she'd say softly. "You'll hurt your eyes." Then she'd vanish again, as if her presence there was forbidden. It wasn't cruelty. It was habit, the habit of staying out of my father's way, even if it meant staying out of mine too. One afternoon, I found an old set of speakers in the garage, the same ones Dad had used back when he still played vinyl records. The wood casing was warped, one speaker cone torn, the wiring frayed. It felt poetic, somehow something once loved, now discarded. I spent 2 nights repairing it, rewiring the terminals, sanding the edges smooth, sealing the cracks with resin. When it was done, I carried it upstairs, proud of the work. Dad was sitting in his chair, reading the sports section. "It works again," I said quietly. "You can use it in the living room." He looked up just long enough to nod. "Good, now grab Ethan a glass of water before dinner." That was it. No acknowledgement, no curiosity, no trace of interest in what I'd done. Just another reminder that even my successes were invisible in this house. I stood there for a moment, realizing the irony. I had just given sound back to something broken, yet no one in this family would ever hear me. That night, I went back to the basement, turned off all the lights, and sat in the dark. The repaired radio played softly in the corner, the same one he'd called useless. I listened to a late-night jazz station, the saxophone notes curling through the air like smoke, and I thought, maybe I wasn't meant to be heard here. Maybe the silence of this house wasn't something to fight, maybe it was something to outgrow. From that moment on, every wire I soldered, every device I repaired became a step closer to freedom. I wasn't just fixing things, I was building an exit. I told myself that one day, I would leave this basement, this house, this entire town, and when I did, I'd never look back. I didn't know where I'd go yet. I just knew it had to be far enough that my father's voice couldn't reach me, and close enough that I could still hear the hum of something. I had built something that worked because I made it work. The letter came on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between a grocery coupon flyer and a stack of unpaid bills. The envelope was white, embossed with a red seal that shimmered faintly in the light. Stanford University Office of Admissions. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I tore it open, scanning the words that would change everything. "Congratulations. We are delighted to offer you a full scholarship." I read the sentence over and over, as if it might vanish if I blinked. Then I ran down the hall, through the kitchen, bursting into the living room where my father sat, his glasses perched low on his nose, reading the sports section as usual. "Dad," I said, breathless. "I got in, full scholarship. Stanford." The name felt sacred on my tongue, like proof that I had finally done something undeniable. For a second, I waited for his reaction, maybe surprise, maybe pride, maybe even a smile. But he just folded the newspaper slowly and looked up with the same expression he might give a weather forecast. "Stanford," he repeated flatly. "That's in California, isn't it?" I nodded, still grinning. "Yeah. It's one of the best engineering programs in the country." He leaned back in his chair, exhaled, and said, "That's too far. Ethan's going to Purdue, much more practical. If you want to go that far, you'll have to figure it out yourself." He picked his newspaper back up, as if the conversation were over. My mother, standing by the sink, murmured, "Your father's just worried about the distance." But she didn't meet my eyes. No one said congratulations. No one took a picture. There was no cake, no dinner, no "we're proud of you." The moment that should have been a victory felt like a private secret, something small enough to fit inside my pocket, where no one could take it away. That night, I went down to the basement, sat by the old workbench, and unfolded the letter again. The words still glowed on the page, but they didn't feel like triumph anymore. They felt like escape. I whispered the name, Stanford, aloud, letting the sound fill the empty room. For the first time, the idea of leaving didn't just excite me, it felt necessary. The months that followed passed in a blur of preparation. I worked part-time at a hardware store to save what little I could, fixed old electronics for neighbors, and sold custom-built speakers online. Every dollar I earned became another inch between me and this house. Ethan, meanwhile, threw a graduation party that took up the entire backyard. My father wore his favorite polo, smiling in every photo beside him. When it was my turn to leave, there was no party. Just a quiet morning and a half-packed suitcase. At the airport, the air smelled of coffee and disinfectant. My mother hugged me quickly, her hands cold against my back. "Call when you land," she said softly. My father stood beside her, his posture stiff, arms crossed. I tried one last time. "I'll send photos when I get there." He nodded, looking somewhere past me. "Just make sure you don't forget where you came from." When it was time to board, I turned back one last time. He wasn't looking at me. He had already turned toward the parking lot, his figure shrinking as he walked away. My mother followed behind him, her head down. Through the glass wall, I pressed my hand against the window, watching their silhouettes fade. For a long moment, I stood there, my palm leaving a faint print on the glass, a mark that would disappear as soon as the next flight took off. On the plane, I kept the Stanford letter folded in my jacket pocket, gripping it whenever I felt the ache of uncertainty rise in my chest. I told myself that maybe, once I was gone, they'd finally see me. That distance might sharpen their vision, make them realize what I'd been all along. But when I landed in California, no message came. "No, we miss you." "No, we're proud." Just silence. The first few weeks were dizzying. The campus was like a different planet, red-tiled roofs, sunlight streaming through palm trees, students in sweatshirts with names of clubs I'd never heard of. I walked across Stanford Oval feeling like an imposter who had wandered into someone else's dream. My roommate's parents flew in from Seattle to help her unpack. They brought flowers, took pictures, and cried when they said goodbye. I stood at the window, pretending not to watch, my hands empty. At night, I lay in my dorm bed, staring at the ceiling fan, thinking about that moment at the airport, my father's back turned, my reflection in the glass. I had traveled 2,000 miles, but the distance inside me had doubled. It wasn't just geography. It was silence, carved into me like a second skin. I poured all that emptiness into work. I studied harder than anyone else, spending hours in the computer lab long after midnight. I joined the robotics team, where the hum of machines replaced the conversations I didn't know how to start. When the circuits lit up, I felt something close to peace, the same quiet satisfaction I used to feel in the basement back home. But sometimes, when I finished a project or earned top marks on an exam, I'd catch myself glancing at my phone, waiting for a text that would never come. That's when I understood. Leaving home doesn't erase the hunger to be seen. It only changes where you starve. I thought distance would make them realize what I was worth. I thought success would make them proud, but I was wrong. It only made the silence louder. The first years in California felt like walking a tightrope suspended between exhaustion and survival. I arrived at Stanford with 2 suitcases, a second-hand laptop, and just enough savings to last 2 months if I stretched every dollar. The scholarship covered tuition, but not food, housing, or books. So I worked 2 part-time jobs, sometimes 3 when hours were short. By day I attended lectures on algorithms and supply chain design. By night, I wiped tables at a cafe near Palo Alto, and on weekends I stocked boxes at a local hardware store. My body never stopped moving, but my mind clung to one quiet mantra: keep going. Dinner was usually a cup of instant noodles or half a sandwich I couldn't finish during my shift. My bed was a sofa in a cramped shared apartment with 2 other students, one studying architecture, the other medicine. They both had parents who wired them money every week. I had silence. On nights when I couldn't sleep, I would stare at the ceiling and let my mind wander back to the basement at home, the whir of machines, the scent of dust and oil. It was strange how something that had once felt like exile now became the only place where I'd ever felt certain of myself. I found a small haven in the university's robotics lab. It was open 24 hours, dimly lit, the air filled with the metallic tang of solder and ozone. There, surrounded by half-assembled drones and tangled wires, I felt alive again. Machines were still my language, predictable, logical, repairable. People, not so much. I would lose hours perfecting a motion sensor or recalibrating a servo, my hands moving on instinct. Sometimes I'd stay so long that the janitor would flick the lights to remind me it was 3 a.m. It was during one of those nights that I collapsed. I hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, hadn't slept in 3. My vision blurred while I was testing a circuit board, and the next thing I knew, I was on the floor with the faint taste of metal in my mouth. A graduate student named Michael found me and rushed me to the campus clinic. When I woke up, he was sitting beside my bed, holding a cup of warm tea. "You need to take care of yourself," he said gently. I wanted to laugh. Take care of myself? That was the only thing I'd been doing since I was old enough to realize no one else would. The doctor told me I was severely anemic, undernourished, and dehydrated. He suggested I call home, maybe ask for help. I nodded, but I knew that wasn't an option. The last message I'd received from my father was months ago, a forwarded link to an article about Ethan's latest football trophy with no comment attached. I deleted it without reading. So I went back to work, slower at first, but more determined. I learned how to survive on little, discount groceries, late-night leftovers, free bread from the cafe after closing. I told myself it was temporary, that struggle was the tax I paid for freedom. And in a way, it was true. Every hardship taught me something: how to code faster, think sharper, repair what others would discard. I started freelancing for small local businesses, helping them automate basic logistics tasks. That's how I first fell in love with the idea of systems, not machines themselves, but the invisible networks that made them work together. By the time I graduated, I had a small portfolio of projects and a reputation among my professors for stubbornness bordering on obsession. When a startup in San Jose reached out looking for an entry-level engineer, I didn't hesitate. They specialized in logistics optimization, designing routes, managing warehouse flow, using AI to reduce waste. The company was small, run by 2 former engineers with big dreams and a cramped office that smelled of burnt coffee and ambition. I started as an intern, earning barely enough to cover rent, but for the first time, I was building something that mattered. The pace was brutal. We worked 12-hour days, sometimes 16. The founders slept on the office couches, and soon I did too. During the early months, our software crashed more than it ran. Clients canceled, investors ghosted us, and at one point, we had only $800 left in the company account. I stayed anyway. I fixed bugs until my eyes stung and rewrote entire modules overnight when systems failed. There was one week I barely saw the sun, just screens glowing in the dark and the steady thump of my heartbeat reminding me I was still alive. One evening, after a particularly long day, I stood outside the office watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. The world around me was quiet: cars passing, neon signs flickering to life, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. No one here cared about Ethan. No one cared who my father was. The only thing that mattered was whether the system worked, whether the code held, whether the trucks moved on time. I had finally found a world where effort was currency, and I could finally afford to exist. But even success inched forward slowly. Months blurred into years, and the exhaustion became familiar, almost comforting. I learned how to write code on 4 hours of sleep, how to make business calls with a fever, how to smile during investor meetings when my hands were shaking from caffeine and stress. It wasn't easy, but it was real. I was building something tangible, brick by invisible brick. Sometimes, when I stayed late after everyone else had gone home, I'd turn on the small radio I kept by my desk, the same model I'd repaired in my father's basement years ago. It played quietly in the corner, filling the sterile office with warmth. I'd watch the monitors flicker and think about how far I'd come. I wasn't anyone's daughter here. I wasn't the other child. I was Isabel Hart, an engineer, a builder, a woman who made systems work. Still, there were nights when loneliness pressed heavy on my chest, the kind of silence that no machine could fill. I would imagine calling home just to hear a familiar voice, but I knew what waited on the other end: indifference, small talk, and maybe a passing mention of Ethan's latest milestone. So, instead, I called no one. I told myself that family could be built the same way as circuits, carefully, intentionally, with patience and design. I just hadn't found the right blueprint yet. Years later, when I looked back at those long nights, the hunger, the fear, the endless grind, I didn't see failure. I saw foundation. Those years didn't break me, they shaped me. They taught me that strength isn't about who catches you when you fall. It's about learning how to stand back up, even when no one notices you're down. I used to think I needed someone to lean on. But the truth is, I didn't have anyone, so I learned how to become the thing I needed most. I became my own anchor, my own safety net, my own place to land. And that, I realized, was the beginning of everything. Success came quietly, almost without warning. One day I was sleeping on a worn leather couch in the corner of the office, eating leftover pizza while debugging a routing algorithm, and the next, our software was being used by hospitals across California. It started small. A few regional clinics testing our logistics system to track medical supply deliveries in real time. Then the pandemic hit, and suddenly, every hospital in the state needed what we had. Demand exploded overnight. The chaos that broke other companies became the wind beneath ours. Our platform, once held together by late nights and borrowed servers, became the unseen backbone of an entire medical network. We optimized routes for ventilators, masks, and oxygen tanks. Our dashboards predicted shortages before they happened, rerouting trucks across states to keep ICUs from collapsing. For months, I barely left the office. My team slept on folding cots between workstations, surviving on caffeine and adrenaline. Every ping from my phone, another shipment delivered, another hospital saved, felt like proof that my years of quiet work finally mattered. News outlets picked up the story. A small California startup is redefining emergency logistics. My inbox flooded with interview requests and partnership offers. One morning, I opened an email from Forbes. Congratulations, you've been selected for the 30 under 30 list in healthcare and technology. I stared at the screen for a long time before it sank in. That basement girl, the one who used to solder old wires while her father bragged about her brother, had just made it into a magazine her parents kept on the coffee table. The ceremony was held in San Francisco, all glass and gold, the kind of place where every surface reflected success back at you. Reporters buzzed around, cameras flashing, people shaking my hand, congratulating me on changing the game. I smiled, I thanked them, I posed for photos under bright lights that made my eyes sting. And then a journalist, a woman with perfect posture and a voice like honey, leaned forward during a live interview. So, Isabel, she said, how does your family feel about your success? The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I froze, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I did. I smiled the same polite smile I'd learned to wear years ago. They're not really into this kind of thing, I said. They don't care much for technology. The interviewer laughed, assuming I was joking. The cameras flashed again. But behind that laugh, something inside me went quiet. Later that night, I sat in my hotel room, the award plaque resting on the desk beside me. The city outside glittered, alive with celebration, but I couldn't feel any of it. I thought of my father sitting in his old recliner, probably watching football, unaware or uninterested that his daughter's name had just been broadcast on national television. I thought of my mother, tidying up after dinner, maybe glancing at the muted TV and flipping the channel before my segment aired. And Ethan, well, he was probably out celebrating some promotion of his own, with friends who cheered his every move. The silence from home was almost predictable. Not even a text, not even a question. I used to think that if I achieved enough, it would force them to see me, that success would be a spotlight bright enough to pierce their indifference. But all the lights in the world couldn't reach them. When the ceremony ended, I stepped outside, holding the glass trophy in one hand and my phone in the other. The night air was cold, the street wet from earlier rain. My reflection in the building's mirrored wall looked like a stranger-tailored suit, confident smile, hair pulled neatly back. I tried to see the girl my father had ignored, the one who used to sit at the kids' table, but she was gone. And yet, in her place, I felt only emptiness. Over the next few months, the company scaled faster than I could have imagined. We partnered with national distributors, expanded to dozens of states, and received acquisition offers from corporate giants. My calendar was packed with board meetings and investor calls. I learned to speak the language of business efficiency, capital, growth, words that sounded powerful but meant little to the child who once just wanted to be seen. Every time a new milestone was reached, someone would say, "You must be so proud." And I'd nod, smile, and thank them. But pride was a strange, foreign thing to me. I didn't feel proud, just tired of chasing an acknowledgement that never came, tired of filling the silence with achievement after achievement. One night, after yet another interview, I went home to my empty apartment in San Jose. I poured myself a glass of wine and scrolled through my phone, past articles praising my visionary leadership. Then I stopped at a photo from the Forbes event, me holding the award, cameras flashing. The caption read, "From basement tinkerer to tech visionary, Isabel Hart proves that grit beats privilege." I stared at that word, privilege. It made me laugh, quietly, almost bitterly. They had no idea. Privilege was Ethan's name engraved on every trophy, his seat at the adult table, the easy comfort of being loved without earning it. What I had wasn't privilege, it was survival dressed up as ambition. I closed my laptop, set the award on the shelf, and sat in the dark. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The glow from the city outside painted soft rectangles on the floor. I realized I had everything I once thought I wanted: success, stability, recognition, but none of it filled the hollow space I'd carried since childhood. When you grow up invisible, you think visibility will save you. You think if you shine bright enough, the people who ignored you will finally turn their heads, but all it does is cast longer shadows. The next morning, I woke before dawn and stood by the window, watching the fog roll over the city. For the first time, I allowed myself to whisper the truth. They'll never see you the way you hoped they would. And strangely, instead of breaking me, the thought felt like freedom. The world saw me now. The headlines saw me. My colleagues saw me. But my parents, they never would. And maybe that was okay. Because somewhere deep inside, I was beginning to understand something even more powerful than being seen. The peace of knowing I no longer needed to be. After the acquisition deal closed, the world around me moved faster than I could feel it. Meetings, contracts, lawyers, headlines, it all blurred together into a single, breathless rush. The number in my bank account didn't feel real. I had lived most of my life counting coins for instant noodles, and now I could buy almost anything I wanted. But when the noise faded and the congratulatory emails stopped pouring in, I realized I didn't want anything. I wanted somewhere that felt like peace. I found it on a gray morning in Seattle. The city was wrapped in mist, the air sharp with the smell of salt and rain. The realtor led me up to a glass-walled apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the living room, the ocean shimmering beyond them like liquid steel. The space was quiet, no echo of footsteps, no hum of conversation, just the distant rhythm of waves meeting the shore. "It's a bit cold for some people," the realtor said, "but it has a view you'll never forget." I didn't need to think twice. I signed the papers that afternoon. The apartment wasn't extravagant, but it felt intentional. every line clean, every detail precise. I filled it slowly, not with luxury but with meaning. The floors were dark walnut, warm under bare feet. The walls were painted a soft shade of cream, catching the light that rolled in from the water. In the center of the main room, I placed a long walnut dining table, 10 chairs, all the same height. No kids' table, no hierarchy. Every seat equal, every voice welcome. I ran my hand along the smooth surface and thought, this is the table I've waited my whole life to sit at. On one wall, I hung my degrees and patents in simple black frames. The Stanford diploma. The company's founding certificate. The engineering patent that had changed my life. I didn't add any family photos. Not out of bitterness, but because I wanted this space to represent the woman I had built from scratch, the one who existed beyond comparison, beyond the shadow of anyone's expectations. I furnished the apartment like someone curating a sanctuary. The couch was deep brown leather, worn enough to feel lived in. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled not with business books but with novels, essays, and old engineering manuals. The kitchen gleamed with polished marble counters, though most nights all I cooked were simple meals, soup, bread, tea. The bedroom faced the bay, where the early sun melted through the fog and painted the walls with silver. It was everything my childhood home wasn't: quiet, balanced, mine. One of the last things I brought into the apartment was the old radio. The same one I'd repaired as a teenager in my father's basement. It was scratched and faded now, the metal knobs dull from years of use. But when I placed it in the corner of the living room and turned it on, it still worked. The speaker crackled before a soft tune emerged, static and melody blending like a memory you don't want to erase. That sound filled the room differently here. Back then, the radio had been my only proof that I could bring something broken back to life. Now it played in a place that existed because I had done exactly that with my life, not just with wires. Sometimes, in the evenings, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the ferries drift across the bay. The skyline shimmered in the distance, quiet, deliberate, like a city that didn't need to prove anything. I realized that was what I wanted for myself. For years, I'd chased success the way a starving person chases warmth, believing that once I had it, I'd finally feel whole. But here, in this stillness, I understood something different. Success was just noise. Peace was the melody underneath. People around me started to notice the change. Colleagues asked why I hadn't bought a mansion, why I chose a quiet place instead of a high-rise penthouse in San Francisco. I smiled and said, because I didn't buy luxury, I bought peace. And it was true. This wasn't a prize, it was a reclamation. Every plank of wood, every piece of glass, every inch of silence was mine, earned through years of invisibility, hunger, and persistence. In this apartment, I could finally breathe. I could play music without turning the volume down. I could eat dinner at my own table without waiting for permission to speak. I could look around and see a life that no one had given me and no one could take away. Some nights, I would leave a single lamp on by the table and let the room go dim. The city lights flickered through the window, dancing across the glass walls like ripples of gold. I'd sit there, tracing the grain of the wood, thinking about the years it took to reach this place. About the basement. The rejection letter that became a scholarship. The nights I coded until my hands cramped. The company born from chaos. And always, that voice my father's echoing faintly from the past. Some kids make you proud. Others just take up space. I smiled every time I thought of it now. Because here I was, 2,000 miles away, surrounded by space I had made for myself. And it was beautiful. The old radio played softly in the background, its sound imperfect but steady. I imagined the younger version of me sitting on the cold concrete floor, holding a soldering iron, dreaming of somewhere she could belong. If she could see me now, the table, the ocean, the quiet, she would understand. I hadn't just built a home. I had built a new world. This place wasn't proof that I'd made it. It was proof that I'd healed. That I'd stopped asking for permission to exist. And in that stillness, Beneath the hum of the radio and the slow rhythm of the sea, I realized something simple and true. I didn't need to fix anything anymore. Not machines, not relationships, not myself. Everything that mattered was already working. 7 years had passed since I last set foot in Indiana. 7 years since I'd stood in that house with its polished oak floors, its heavy curtains, its photographs of Ethan smiling from every wall. The invitation came in an email, polite, almost sterile. Thanksgiving dinner. 6 p.m. Hope you can make it. Signed simply. Mom. No mention of Dad, no warmth, no apology, just an address I still knew by heart. For a long time, I hovered over the delete button. I didn't owe them my presence, not after the years of silence. But something in me, not bitterness, exactly, but closure, whispered that it was time. Not to reconcile. Just to return, one last time, and see the people who had once made me small, now from the vantage point of someone who no longer was. The flight to Indianapolis felt surreal. I watched clouds roll by beneath the wing and thought about all the miles between the girl who had left and the woman who was returning. I wasn't coming back to prove anything. I didn't need to. My life in Seattle had already answered every unasked question. But this, I told myself, wasn't about victory. It was about ending the story on my own terms. When I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, everything looked smaller. The maple tree that once seemed enormous now barely brushed the second-floor windows. The porch light still flickered, like it always had, because no one ever bothered to fix it. Inside, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the air, familiar, almost painfully so. My mother opened the door, smiling nervously. "You look different," she said. "Older. Beautiful." I smiled softly. Time does that. Ethan was already at the table, his wife beside him, their 2 kids whispering into iPads. My father sat at the head, as always, carving the turkey with mechanical precision. He looked older too, his hair thinner, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his presence still filled the room like static electricity. When he looked up and saw me, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe. Then it vanished. Dinner began in small talk. The usual updates: Ethan's promotion, the kids' school achievements, the new car. No one asked about Seattle, or the company, or the Forbes list. I didn't mind. I wasn't here for their curiosity. I cut my food slowly, listened, smiled when it was polite to. The sound of silverware on porcelain filled the gaps between words. Then, as the plates cleared and the second bottle of wine opened, my father lifted his glass. "A toast," he said, and immediately the room quieted. His voice was the same, calm, deep, the kind that demanded attention. He looked at Ethan, then at me, and said, "Some kids make you proud. Others." His lips curved into that familiar smirk. "Just take up space." "Okay." The laughter came easily, just like it used to. Ethan chuckled, his wife covered her mouth to hide a grin. Even the children giggled, not understanding why. My mother looked down at her plate, the way she always did when she wanted to disappear. For a second, the old ache rose in my chest, that instinct to shrink, to let it pass, to pretend it didn't hurt. But the woman sitting there wasn't the girl who once hid in the basement. I set my fork down gently and looked at him. "Good thing I just bought my own place," I said evenly, my voice calm but sharp enough to slice through the laughter. 3,000 kilometers away, so no one has to make space for me anymore. The laughter stopped instantly. Forks froze. The room fell into that thick, airless silence that follows a truth no one expected to hear. My father's smirk faltered. He blinked, as if unsure whether I was joking. My mother finally looked up, her eyes wide. Ethan shifted in his chair, suddenly fascinated by his glass. I held his gaze. Not with anger, but with something far more dangerous: indifference. Then I smiled. "Thank you for dinner," I said quietly, pushing my chair back. The food was lovely. No one moved as I stood. I walked around the table, my heels clicking softly against the wood floor. At the doorway, I paused and turned back, taking in the scene one last time, the table where I was never enough, the faces that had never really seen me. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said. "And don't worry, I won't take up any more space." Then I left. The night air outside was cold and clean, the sky above a deep indigo scattered with stars. I walked down the driveway to my rental car, the sound of the door closing behind me sealing something larger than just a meal. It sealed a lifetime. As I drove away, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry, either. I just felt free. For years, I had thought that healing meant reconciliation, that peace required understanding. But now I realized sometimes peace is simply walking away without the need for anyone to follow. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, the headlights carving tunnels through the dark. I rolled the window down, letting the cold wind whip across my face. The old radio, yes, I'd brought it with me, sat on the passenger seat, playing a faint, crackling song from some late-night station. And as I listened, I thought of the girl I once was sitting at the kids' table, small, invisible, waiting for her turn to belong. I wanted to tell her this: you never needed a seat at their table. You were always meant to build your own. When I reached the edge of the city, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The house was far behind me, swallowed by the dark. I didn't need to see it anymore. I had already left the part of me that needed it there, and she could finally rest. I didn't win that night by saying something clever. I didn't win at all. I simply stood up and walked away. And that was enough. Christmas arrived wrapped in the soft gray mist of the Pacific Northwest, the kind that blurred the line between sea and sky until everything looked like peace. In the week leading up to it, my apartment by the bay slowly transformed. Evergreen wreaths hung over the glass doors, threaded with crimson berries and strands of golden light. The long walnut table that had once stood empty now gleamed under the gentle glow of candles. For the first time since I'd bought this place, I wasn't preparing for solitude, I was preparing to share it. It started as a simple idea, an antidote to the hollow echo of that Thanksgiving night. I didn't want to spend Christmas pretending the silence from my family didn't sting. I wanted to fill that silence with something real, something human. So I opened my door to everyone who had ever been made to feel small, unseen, or forgotten. I wrote the invitations by hand. To my former robotics professor at Stanford, Dr. Liang, who had once told me, "The world needs more quiet builders." To Nora, a fellow engineer who'd been laughed out of her old job after standing up to her boss. To my neighbor, a single father named Miguel, who worked double shifts and still managed to coach his son's soccer team. To an older couple from my building who had lost touch with their own children. To my cousin, Sarah, the only relative who had ever defended me at family dinners, even when it cost her their approval. And, most tender of all, to my grandmother. When I called her, her voice cracked on the other end. "Seattle? Oh, sweetheart, that's so far." "Grandma," I said, smiling into the receiver. "I'll send the ticket. You just bring yourself." She chuckled softly. "You sound like your mother used to before she learned to whisper." On Christmas Eve, the first snow of the season dusted the city in quiet silver. Inside, the apartment glowed like a lantern. The table was set with white porcelain plates and clear crystal glasses, their reflections dancing in the candlelight. Sprigs of pine and cranberry ran down the center like a river of winter. The air smelled of rosemary, butter, and salt. The chef I'd hired, a local named Mason, had filled the kitchen with the scent of roasted salmon and fresh bread. A playlist of soft acoustic carols floated through the space, just loud enough to feel like warmth. One by one, they arrived. Nora came first, holding a bottle of wine and laughing through the cold. Dr. Liang brought a book wrapped in newspaper, muttering that he hadn't had time for proper wrapping paper. Miguel and his son brought dessert, homemade flan still warm in its tin. My grandmother arrived last, her small frame bundled in a red coat, her eyes shining brighter than the lights around us. When everyone had settled, I stood at the head of the table. For a moment, I simply looked at the faces turned toward me, each marked by its own version of resilience. Then I said, I know some of us didn't have a place to go this Christmas. But tonight, I wanted to make sure everyone had a seat. No one at the kids' table. No one in the corner. No one forgotten. Laughter rippled around the table, gentle, genuine. I sat down, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own story. Dinner unfolded in slow, beautiful waves. Mason brought out plates of cedar-planked salmon glazed with honey and soy, bowls of wild mushroom risotto, and baskets of warm sourdough. Wine flowed easily, conversation even easier. Nora told stories about working night shifts in tech, turning corporate arrogance into comedy. Dr. Liang recounted the time I'd accidentally flooded the robotics lab with foam during an experiment, which made everyone laugh so hard I nearly spilled my drink. Miguel's son, a bright-eyed 9-year-old, challenged everyone to a trivia game he'd made on his tablet and somehow managed to beat all of us. The table was alive, clinking glasses, shared laughter, hands reaching for bread. No competition, no hierarchy. Just connection. Between courses, I slipped into the kitchen to refill a tray of drinks. My grandmother followed, quiet as always. She stood beside me for a moment, watching me work, then said softly, You know, Isabel, I've sat at many tables in my life. Big ones, small ones, ones where people spoke too loudly and ones where no one spoke at all. But this. She gestured toward the laughter drifting from the dining room. This feels like the first real family dinner I've been to in a long time. I swallowed hard, blinking back tears. It's not really family, Grandma, not by blood. She smiled, reaching for my hand. No, sweetheart. Better. It's by choice. When we returned, dessert had already begun. Slices of flan passed around, plates cluttered with crumbs and joy. Someone had turned up the music slightly, and a few people were singing softly along. I looked around the table and realized that every person there carried a story of exclusion. The teacher who wasn't taken seriously because of his accent. The colleague dismissed for her gender. The cousin labeled too emotional. The grandmother treated as background noise by her own children. Every single one of them had been told, in one way or another, that they took up too much space. And yet here we were, filling a room beautifully. As the night deepened, I raised my glass. To the ones who were left out, I said. And to the ones who learned to build new tables. The room fell quiet, then erupted in gentle cheers. Glasses clinked. Someone began humming along to the music again. Later, when the plates were empty and the candles had burned low, we all stayed at the table talking, sharing memories, laughing about nothing and everything. I noticed how easily everyone listened to one another. No interruptions. No comparisons. Just warmth. My grandmother reached for my hand again, her voice a whisper meant just for me. You did it, Isabel, she said. You built the kind of family your father never understood. Augre. I turned my head toward her, the flicker of candlelight catching in her eyes. I didn't build it alone, I said. They came, and they made it real. She nodded slowly. That's what real families do. They make each other real. When everyone had gone home, and the apartment had fallen silent again, I stood by the window overlooking the dark bay. Snow still fell, soft and endless. The table behind me was a beautiful mess, empty glasses, napkins folded into careless hearts, the faint scent of pine and vanilla lingering in the air. I thought about the home I had grown up in, the rigid lines, the quiet expectations, the laughter that never reached me. And then I looked around this room, filled hours earlier with imperfect, ordinary people who had chosen to show up, to care, to belong. In that moment, I understood something I never had before. Family isn't where you come from, it's where you are seen. No one here shared my last name, but every heart that had walked through my door that night had left something behind, a piece of grace, a spark of healing, a fragment of the love we were all still learning how to give. I walked over to the corner of the room where the old radio Saturday. I turned the dial gently until a faint tune drifted out, a soft jazz version of Silent Night. The same song that had played in the basement all those years ago when I dreamed of a different life. Only now, it didn't sound like longing. It sounded like home. As the snow thickened outside, I whispered to no one in particular. There's no family here tonight by blood. But every heart in this room was real. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the city wrapped in quiet white. The apartment still smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon, the table a battlefield of crumbs and candle wax. I was barefoot, holding a mug of coffee, watching sunlight stretch across the floor when my phone buzzed on the counter. At first, I ignored it. I wasn't ready to return to the noise of the world. But when it rang again, then again, I glanced at the screen. Dad. My thumb hovered over the answer button. 7 years of silence, and he was calling now? I hesitated, then swiped to accept. Isabel. His voice was sharp, controlled, the same tone he used when I was a child and had done something he considered foolish. Do you know what's happening right now? I frowned. Good morning to you, too. He ignored that. The entire town's seen those pictures. Pictures? The Christmas dinner, he snapped. Someone posted them online, your cousin, I think. Everyone's sharing it. The warmest Christmas dinner in Seattle. You and your group. People are calling it inspiring. I blinked, surprised. I hadn't even realized anyone had taken photos. Sarah must have posted them. She loved documenting moments. Apparently, he continued, voice rising. You said something about building a table for the forgotten? You think that's funny? The comments, they're saying how your family rejected you, how you built your own. You made us look like fools, Isabel. The whole town's talking. I leaned against the counter, staring out the window. I didn't make you look like anything, Dad. You did that all on your own. Watch your tone. There it was, the command, the old dominance, as if time hadn't passed. But I didn't shrink this time. My voice stayed steady, calm like the sea outside. I didn't mention your names. I didn't blame anyone. I just hosted dinner for people who didn't have a place to go. He scoffed. And you called it family? I smiled faintly. It felt like one. There was silence, sharp, uncomfortable. I could almost hear him pacing, picture him gripping the phone too tightly. You always did love dramatics, he said finally. All this self-pity, parading your so-called independence. What, you think you're better than us now? No, I said softly. I think I finally stopped needing you to tell me I'm enough. That. He exhaled hard, as though my calmness offended him more than any argument could. You have no idea how disrespectful this is. Your mother's been humiliated. Your brother called this morning, says people are asking what happened between us. You've dragged our family through the mud just to play the victim. I closed my eyes. There it is, I thought. The story they'd always needed to tell, that I was the problem, that I'd turned my back on them. I had lived my whole life trying to rewrite that narrative. But now, I realized, I didn't have to. They could keep their version. I had mine. Dad, I said, quiet but firm. You're upset because people saw something true, not because I said it. You've always cared more about how things look than how they are. Don't you dare talk to me like. Robert, that's enough. The voice came from somewhere behind him, faint but unmistakable. My grandmother. I hadn't realized she was with him. Maybe she'd gone there after the holidays. Maybe she'd heard the whole conversation. Mom. He started, but she cut him off. No, you listen to me now. Her voice, though weak with age, carried more authority than his ever had. I saw those pictures too. I saw her table. There was a long pause. I could imagine my father stiffening, ready to defend himself. But my grandmother didn't let him. She didn't shame you, Robert. She didn't even mention your name. She showed people something beautiful, a room full of souls who had nowhere else to go, sitting together, being seen. That's not humiliation. That's grace. He said nothing. She's not taking up space, my grandmother continued softly. She built a table big enough for everyone who was told there wasn't one. Even for you. Silence filled the line, a silence thick and trembling, the kind that comes when truth finally pierces pride. I stood by the window, gripping the edge of the counter, listening to the faint hum of the call. Finally, my father spoke, quieter now. You don't understand, Mom. People, she interrupted, will forget by next week. But your daughter will remember this moment for the rest of her life. Don't make her remember that her father called her success an embarrassment. He didn't answer. Robert, she said again, gentler now, for once in your life, just be proud of her. Even if you don't understand her. That's all she ever wanted. There was a faint sound, maybe the phone shifting hands, maybe the scrape of a chair. Then my grandmother's voice, closer to the receiver. Sweetheart? I swallowed hard. I'm here, Grandma. I saw the photos. It was a beautiful dinner. Her voice trembled. You looked happy, truly happy. I whispered. I'm proud of you, she said simply. Those 4 words hit deeper than any award or headline ever could. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I pressed my palm to the glass, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, letting her words sink into the space where all the old wounds used to live. Thank you, I managed. That means everything. I know, she said softly. Then, after a pause, don't let his anger make you doubt what you've built. Men like your father don't know how to love without control. But you loved without permission. That's stronger. How it though good. I smiled through the tears I hadn't realized were falling. I think I finally understand that. The line went quiet for a few seconds, then I heard her say gently, I should go, darling. He's pacing holes in the carpet. I laughed, a sound full of release. Go easy on him. No, she said, amusement in her voice. He could use a little discomfort. When the call ended, I stood there in the sunlight, my phone still warm in my hand. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was clean. I didn't feel guilt for walking away, or sorrow for what was broken. I just felt light. I poured myself another cup of coffee and walked over to the window. The bay shimmered under the winter sun, the world outside impossibly still. For the first time in my life, my father's voice didn't echo inside me anymore. It had been replaced by another, my grandmother's, firm, loving, and infinitely clear. She didn't take up space. She built a new table. And as I watched the waves move in slow, endless rhythm, I realized I had finally done the same. For years, I'd carried the guilt of leaving, the fear that independence made me ungrateful, that success made me selfish. But that morning, with the ocean shining before me and her words still in my chest, I understood something simple and profound. Leaving wasn't betrayal. It was survival. And survival, in its quietest form, was the truest kind of love, the love that builds space for others to breathe. For the first time, I didn't feel like the girl who had walked away. I felt like the woman who had arrived. New Year's Eve crept in quietly that winter, not with fireworks or noise, but with the kind of stillness that feels like a page turning. The bay outside my window shimmered in soft blues and silvers, city lights reflecting off the water like 1,000 quiet candles. A week had passed since the call from my father, and my grandmother's words still echoed in my chest. I'd replayed them more times than I could count. She didn't take up space. She built a new table. I sat at my desk that morning, watching the slow fall of snow against the glass, and typed a short message. New Year's Eve dinner. If you and Mom would like to come, there's a seat for you. But only if everyone agrees to sit at the same table, no head, no kids, no hierarchy. Equal seats. Equal voix. I hovered over the send button for a moment, my thumb trembling slightly, not out of fear, but from something quieter, acceptance. Then I pressed send. I didn't expect a reply. But 2 hours later, one arrived. It was from my mother. We'd like to come. Your father said yes. The words were simple. No apologies, no explanations, but they were enough. That evening, I set the table again. 10 chairs, perfectly aligned, candles flickering softly, the sea beyond the windows stretching into darkness. The same table that had once been a symbol of defiance now felt like an invitation not for reconciliation, but for understanding. At 7 sharp, the elevator chimed. When the door opened, my parents stood there, both looking smaller than I remembered. Time had carved fine lines around their eyes, and the confidence they once wore like armor seemed to have faded. My father's posture was still stiff, his pride intact, but his eyes flickered with something new uncertainty. My mother smiled nervously, clutching a small box wrapped in silver paper. "Hi, Isabel," she said softly. "Hi, Mom. Come in." They stepped inside, glancing around the apartment. My father's gaze lingered on the wall where my degrees and patents hung framed proof of the life they had chosen not to see. He said nothing, but I saw the faint tightening of his jaw. Dinner was quiet at first. The air carried the careful politeness of strangers trying to remember how to speak to one another. I served roasted halibut, rosemary potatoes, and wine from a small vineyard near Oregon. My mother complimented the view, the food, the candles, anything but the distance between us. My father mostly listened, pushing his fork around his plate, glancing occasionally at the radio in the corner. Finally, it was my mother who broke the silence. "You always liked music," she said softly, nodding toward it. "Even when you were little. You used to fix that old thing downstairs, remember?" I smiled faintly. "I remember." A long pause stretched across the table. The city lights danced through the glass behind them, painting soft gold across their faces. Then, unexpectedly, my father spoke. "Maybe." He hesitated, his voice lower now. "Maybe I didn't see it." I looked up. "See what?" He exhaled. "What you were doing. Who you were becoming. I thought Ethan was the one who needed us more. You always seemed self-sufficient." My mother nodded slowly. "I think I told myself you were fine, Isabel. You never complained, you just kept going. I didn't realize that silence doesn't mean peace." Her words landed gently, without defense or excuse, just a kind of late honesty. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I wanted to let it breathe, to let them feel the weight of what was being said. My father looked down at his hands. "I shouldn't have said what I said that night," he murmured. "The toast." I let out a small breath, not quite laughter, not quite forgiveness. "It's all right," I said softly. "You were right, in a way. Some kids do make their parents proud, others just make themselves free." He looked up, startled by the calmness in my voice. But there was no anger there. Only truth. The rest of the evening passed in fragments of memory's small stories, laughter that felt tentative but real, pauses that weren't uncomfortable anymore. For the first time, we weren't a hierarchy. We were just 3 people sitting at the same table, learning how to exist without old rules. Ethan had been invited, but he hadn't come. My mother mentioned him once, then stopped, sensing it wasn't the night for comparisons. After dinner, I poured us each a glass of champagne. Midnight was only minutes away. I stood and walked toward the balcony, the crisp night air meeting my face as I opened the glass door. Behind me, the city hummed fireworks readying in the distance, laughter spilling from nearby apartments. My parents followed, standing quietly on either side of me. The sea below shimmered in moonlight, the sound of the waves rising and falling like breath. I raised my glass and said softly, "To new tables, and to equal seats. I'll enter." My father looked at me, then nodded. "To equal seats," he echoed. For the first time in my life, the words didn't sound forced. We stood there as fireworks bloomed above the water, bursts of red and gold lighting the sky. I thought about every dinner table I'd ever sat at. The kids' table that made me invisible, the family table where I was the afterthought, the empty table in my Seattle apartment that became a symbol of self-respect. And now this one imperfect, quiet, human. When the last firework faded, my parents said goodnight. My mother hugged me for a long time before leaving. My father lingered a moment, as if he wanted to say something else, then simply said, "Take care of yourself, Isabel." "I always do," I said. When the door closed behind them, the apartment fell silent again. But it wasn't the old kind of silence, the cold, echoing kind. It was soft, earned, full of space. I walked back to the balcony, still holding my glass. The reflections of the city rippled across the water like tiny constellations. I took a slow sip, feeling the bubbles sting the back of my throat, and whispered into the night, "Some kids make their parents proud, others make themselves free." The words drifted into the air, dissolving into the sound of the sea. Inside, the candles on the table flickered, their flames swaying gently. The radio hummed a slow jazz tune, the same one I'd played on Christmas. I stood there for a long time, listening to the soft rhythm of the city, to the heartbeat of a life I had built without permission. Then, turning toward the camera, toward the invisible audience that had followed my story all this way, I said quietly, "If you've ever been told that you take up too much space, remember this: you can build your own place. And if you do it with heart, with courage, with love, it won't just be a place. It will be a whole world." The music swelled softly as I set my glass down on the railing. "Don't wait to be invited to their table," I added. "Build your own. And make it wide enough for everyone who was once told they didn't belong." The scene lingered, the woman standing against the sea, the lights of Seattle behind her, the radio still whispering the same soft tune. Then, slowly, the camera faded to black. And with it came peace, not the peace of being accepted, but the peace of being whole.